Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, it's an X-Men prequel double feature. We're doing X-Men Origins Wolverine and X-Men First Class because we were supposed to get the New Mutants this week, but obviously that's not happening for the reason everybody knows. So we're doing this instead, and which means we had to subject ourselves to X-Men Origins Wolverine. We will get to that. But first and foremost, just a couple quick calls to action. We did want to thank Tobias for becoming a new premium subscriber over at patreon.com/genrevision. Thank you so much, Tobias. And now Tobias can access all the cool stuff that we're doing over at Patreon. And we have more cool stuff that we're planning. Some new things that we talked about on some recent Patreon, the currently consuming and the pre-show banters that we've done. We've got another new thing that we're cooking up. Tobias will get to listen to that, and so will you if you decide to become a premium subscriber. And we got a brand new review in for our other show, Fin Flicks, by Rory Duty. Says 5 stars, love these guys. Already a fan of Genre Vision. This offshoot has a staggered release schedule, but is always worth the wait. Jaws 3D, best episode yet. Support them on Patreon. Now more than ever, we need art and artists and the entertainment they provide. Thank you so much, Rory.
I don't know how to thank you all enough. This is awesome. Thank you.
It's incredibly awesome. And you know, especially for fan, like our Jaws 3D is a really good episode of that show.
It's super fun.
So check that out. And again, thank you so much, Rory. But now it's time for the X-Men prequel double feature. And, you know, Travis was the one that suggested this when New Mutants got pulled off the schedule. And, man, I mentioned that I was watching X-Men Origins Wolverine on Twitter, and somebody replied, with everything that's going on in the world, why would you also subject yourself to this movie? But I am definitely can see, Travis, kind of what your mindset was, because these are both prequels for the X-Men franchise, and they happened back to back as far as their release schedule goes. And you could not have a larger gap in quality between two movies in the same franchise.
We were wondering for a long time what would happen with New Mutants, and, you know, what would it be like? Would it be any good? We may never know. There was a while where we thought we would certainly never know, and then now, well, we'll most likely never know. So looking back at the X-Men franchise, there's a pretty big spectrum of quality, and it was odd to me that we had 2 films in a row, 2 Origins movies that effectively displayed, I think, the far ends of the quality spectrum. X-Men Origins Wolverine came out in 2009, as a way to find a new direction for the X-Men series after X-Men Last Stand, which was not particularly well received. They wanted to kind of take it back to what everybody liked about X-Men, which they thought was Hugh Jackman and his character. So taking it to Wolverine's origin, yeah, okay, I get why they would do this as a business approach. It seems smart given what they knew about why people were coming to see these movies. But boy, this movie does not have an excellent reputation. I actually think it deserves a worse reputation. This movie is garbage.
So here's the thing, like when this movie was just about to be released, it also leaked online as a work print version with unfinished effects shots. There is speculation that was possibly done vindictively because the people working on it or somebody knew that the movie was not a good movie and wanted to sabotage it. There's no proven, this is all allegedly, but this was a movie that was also intended to kickstart a new branch of the X-Men franchise, which is going to be called X-Men Origins. There was planning to be X-Men Origins Magneto after this, which we'll get to when we talk about First Class. But X-Men Origins Wolverine, my biggest issue with it as an origin movie is that you could not have done a more stock origin for a character that people were so crazy about and so in love with. And if you're going to do an origin story, you're going to have to really justify why we need to see an element of a character that we've already spent plenty of time with. We know who this person is as a character. What is it about their origin story that really is different than surprising? And X-Men Origins Wolverine just decides to plug Wolverine into the most cliched action bullshit of all time.
This even comes across in the dialogue. So many lines are just stock lines that you expect movie characters to say. There's at one point a character dying in the movie, toward the end of the movie, and she says, "I'm so cold." And then she dies, and then, Wolverine closes her eyelids for her. It's like, this is every stock beat. Mm-hmm. Going back to the start of the film, they, I think, make a smart choice by starting at the very beginning. We see Wolverine as a young Canadian child in an old Canadian room in a ye olde Canadian bed, and he's a sickly young lad. Of course, can't be the strong boy that we remember. They call him Jimmy. His brother is there. His brother looks to be a few years older than he is, and we eventually know that the brother is Victor Creed, who I believe they're under the impression that they're half brothers at the start of the film. Turns out not true. Both of them have the same father. This dad is evidently a real mean guy, and he dies at the beginning of the movie when he gets shot.
Yes. You told me right from the get-go. I mean, it was minutes into the movie, and you were like, this is already busted.
Yeah, the rhythm of everything is off. The drama is not present at all. Like, this should be a kind of a moody opening. You're going back into a period that is previously unexplored in these films. Like, this should be something that's markedly different. This should be something that people have never seen before, and it should feel different. And yet it feels like bad TV is what it feels like. The tone and the approach to it is just completely off. It's a very bad edit immediately. You can kind of tell. It's like these beats in the scenes aren't falling where they should.
X-Men Origins Wolverine is an unending list of problems, but one that I don't see talked about a lot is the editing. When we were watching this, we were doing a synchronized watch of this. The editing is so all over the place. 1 minute it is very chaos cinema, especially in the action scenes, but then also the rhythm of edits never clicks into place. And a lot of the times edits for scene transitions are completely unmotivated.
This is where we start to get into the weird vagaries of what is editing in movies. There is a sense of micro editing in which you're going from one shot to the next in a scene. And those cuts can be timed well, or they can be sort of off rhythm and not feel correct and not feel satisfying. And then there's this macro editing sense, which is things like, well, how does this scene transition to the next scene? Or how is the pacing overall in the second act? Bigger questions like that. But when you look at macro editing, it's pretty much writing. An edit is a chance to rewrite your movie. But also, if you're going to have an effective scene transition, you have to write for it. Mm-hmm. When you're writing the screenplay, before production ever happens, you have to have an intention to tell the story beats in a certain order and to kind of link them together in a way that makes logical sense.
We'll talk about this when we get to First Class, but
yes, Wolverine Origins is really, really bad at this. And one of the reasons it fails so heavily is that the first half of the film is all built on mystery. Why are these characters here? Who is this character? Why are they doing these things? The film wants to hold off on all of it. And it would be one thing if the mystery was at all interesting or intriguing, but these are already characters that we're familiar with, and the movie assumes a lot of familiarity, or that you do have a lot of familiarity with these characters. So in so many ways, it just feels like, well, this is leading to an inevitable place. Just cut the mystery bullshit.
That is one of the inherent obstacles with prequelization. We know where a character is going to end up, so why does this story matter? You have to figure that out when you're deciding to do a prequel.
X2 already treaded these grounds very heavily.
Yes. So X-Men Origins Wolverine also has the problem of bizarre structure in the writing, if this is how it was structured on the page, in which Logan and Victor end up, or I should say Jimmy and Victor. Jimmy the mutant. They end up just kind of bopping around from war to war over the years in an awful opening credits montage that is just the worst kind of style for style's sake.
There is one fun match cut in that sequence, but otherwise the sequence is just, it's all whoosh and flash and like really heavily stylized looks, like really grainy film stock and like really strong bleach bypassing. It's clear that they're just kind of borrowing looks from certain things. Like they wanted to have a D-Day sequence that looks like what else? Saving Private Ryan. Or they wanted to have a Vietnam sequence that looks like what we assume Vietnam should look like in a movie, whether it be Apocalypse Now or Universal Soldier, just that standard stock stuff. Yeah, exactly.
But then they're thrown into a prison after trying to be executed, and Danny Houston shows up and is just like, hey, be on my team. And then they're on a team like immediately. We don't get introductions for the team members except to like, all right, Dominic Monaghan, you close your eyes and make this elevator go. Ryan Reynolds is Deadpool. Swing your swords around and deflect bullets. That's as much introduction as we get. And then the movie shifts gears to some years later after Logan has left the team, and Victor, Sabretooth, I'm just going to call him Sabretooth. Sabretooth is hunting down the members of this team. And the first one that we see is he hunts down Dominic Monaghan's character, who is holed up in some rinky-dink carnival. And this sequence was the first time I'm like, why was this not one of the earliest things we saw in the movie? Because this establishes mystery. Who is Victor? Why is he hunting this person down? The introduction to this person's powers is actually really clever. And it's this like carnival game with a light bulb that he's rigged up. I will give the movie that one bit of cleverness.
Yeah, it almost seems like this should have taken place earlier in the film if they had gone less chronological with their structure. So much of the action in the film, you know, they're doing almost no storytelling through action. It's all just like Kurt Wimmer jack-offery.
God, yes.
Like there's this character named Zero who is basically the mutant gunman for Danny Houston's character. And it's all just like hollow Kurt Wimmer stuff. I mean, I know there are some people out there who really like Kurt Wimmer stuff because his hollow style is just like so ludicrous and stuff. But
I think an even better through line that people might understand more is it's like Paul W.S. Anderson stuff. Like the worst of the Resident Evil stuff.
Yeah.
Where like the scene where Zero throws his CG guns into the air and they come right up to camera and they slow down and everything. It's like this was everything bad that people were doing post Matrix. And this is what, 10 years after the Matrix.
Right. Yeah. It's weird. Characters in the Matrix, it doesn't feel like they're showing off. You know what I mean? and in these movies, it's just cool guys doing cool guy shit showing off.
Well, and it was also in the Matrix that they were inside of a computer program that could be manipulated to do these strange things.
Yeah.
Whereas in movies, it's just like, that just looks cool. And no, it doesn't. So
we're 15 minutes into the movie at this point. You sent me a message as we were doing our watch together. You said, we're 15 minutes in. This is nothing but empty plot. And then I replied to you, there really isn't even a plot because we don't know why anyone is doing anything and why the people are even in the scenes to begin with. Like, you know, after the team is just magically quickly assembled, they're going to Nigeria to do something. And then somewhere else in Africa and in a later scene, after a really awkward scene transition, the only thing you get is Danny Houston is looking for meteorites. That's it.
Yes, which, you know, this will all lead up to, it's like, oh, well, that's adamantium, because you all know what adamantium is, because this movie absolutely assumes that you've seen the other X-Men movies. It does not work on its own two legs. You need to know who Logan is on some level from the prior three X-Men movies to have some kind of footing with what this is attempting to do.
So in this scene in Africa, you know, where we find out that Danny Houston is looking for meteorites, Liev Schreiber's character, who we eventually know as Sabretooth, is menacing some villager, and Logan eventually decides, like, in this very scene, no, this is too much for me. I have to leave this group because my bad brother is finally crossing some arbitrary line. Like, he fought fucking how many wars with this guy where he committed terrible atrocities, and just now he's deciding that, I can't do this anymore. Why? Yeah. It's a totally unmotivated decision. Because
that's what the screenwriting book that they read said, well, at this minute mark, this is when, you know, this kind of event needs to happen.
Logan, at this point, just leaves the group. There is a thunder strike and a lightning flash for no reason, if only to give us a scene transition. and he starts living his Arnold Schwarzenegger and Commando existence in the mountains with the logs.
His Mandy existence, yep. So here's the thing. There's lots of things about this movie that people have railed on since its release and that have become kind of the markers of why it's bad. Bad effects stuff. And yes, that stuff's there. A rushed story, bad use of characters like Deadpool. Yeah, those things are all problems, but I don't think they're the real core problems of why X-Men Origins Wolverine is a bad movie.
No, I mean, X-Men Origins Wolverine gets a lot of shit from fans for not delivering what it is that they want. And that can make it an unsatisfying movie from a fandom standpoint, but from a filmmaking standpoint, this movie's so fucking busted.
It's extremely busted. There's never any interesting or even sometimes competent lighting.
No, that's this weird scene in a barn later after Logan eventually, gets adamantiumed and he escapes from the facility and he winds up in a fucking barn. And the interior of the barn is basically lit like it's a stage play. It's
shockingly flat. And again, I know we can sometimes get hung up on we always need lighting and stuff to be interesting and dynamic. It doesn't, it just needs to make a place feel like a place.
Or to establish an effective mood. It doesn't have to look realistic or anything like that. But this is totally devoid of anything, that the movie thinks it's executing or the movie is trying to execute. It's just never there. Eventually, a woman comes into the barn. She's standing in front of a window that is clearly just a green screen.
One of the best parts of the movie.
Very poorly composited, so it immediately draws your attention to something's going to come in through the window. It's a bullet. She gets shot. Her performance at getting shot is hilarious.
It's great.
The camera zooms out the window into what appears to be the default desktop for Windows XP.
It very well could be. Yeah, I mean, there are laughably bad things that happen in X-Men Origins Wolverine, but it's not that kind of movie through and through where it's this understands that it's being goofy and stupid and ridiculous and having fun with it. One of the other biggest problems with X-Men Origins Wolverine is that it takes itself extremely seriously.
Right. It wants to be the cool, badass, Commando type movie. But it has no sense of camp.
Well, and it doesn't need to have a sense of camp. It doesn't even necessarily need to have a sense of goofiness. It just needs to understand that when you have an explosion that launches Wolverine through the sky into a helicopter, that's ridiculous, and that should be super fun. In concept, that is super fun. The movie never thinks of itself as super fun. It is so po-faced, but at the same time, it's also going to go to a scene where Taylor Kitsch shoots floating playing cards that blow up. It's you can't do the grounded, serious version of that.
Well, and there are plenty of scenes that are attempting to be funny and to have, comic relief. There's a scene, for instance, that they go to Vegas because he's looking for Kevin Durant's character, who is part of the original team that goes to Nigeria. And this character, in the years between Jimmy leaving the crew and becoming Logan, he's gotten enormously fat. So now he's the Blob. And there are so many attempts at jokes in this scene that fall so flat. They fall down harder than Kevin Durant does at the end of that scene. It is painful, this movie trying to execute anything relating to humor. And unfortunately, they give a bunch of lines that are trying to be funny or clever to fucking Will.I.am.
We're hunting our own kind, Logan.
Oh my God. He's so bad in the movie.
Well, we're talking about that tonal shit where it's you and I don't have personal problems with tonal shifts if the movie can execute them well.
Sure.
A lot of people want movies to have tonal consistency throughout, and that's a mark of good use of tone. That's neither here nor there, but for us, it's tonal variation is not an inherently bad thing. But in a movie like X-Men Origins Wolverine, where you have all of this, Logan's moping around and screaming at the sky because his girlfriend is dead and he's being, gruff and mean, and I got to revenge Ma and Pa Kent who got killed for nothing. And then cut to he's in Vegas making fat jokes, and it's this doesn't feel like the same character.
And there are other Wolverine solo movies that have kind of aced this right out of the gate. James Mangold's Wolverine, the one he did before Logan, it's not a great movie. It's an adequate movie in so many ways. It's just sort of straight down the middle, but it's an incredible improvement on this. It understanding its tone is such an important thing, like, because it understands what it's trying to execute, and it does it in a fairly adequate way. And it's James Mangold, so it's directed fairly well. And then they took that sort of one step further with Logan. So they found, like, okay, we can have this character be the serious, gruff, traumatized warrior that we're saying that he is. He's full of vengeance and spite and pain. It's like, okay, we know how to make that happen on film. But to have that character be a crowd-pleasing, quipping hero, sometimes the X-Men movies execute that okay. This one has clearly no clue how to do that.
And there's just nothing dramatically interesting at the heart of X-Men Origins Wolverine. And unfortunately, piled on top of that is its prequel issues, where after a certain point, you're like, I know where this has to go. We know that if you've done your homework like the movie expects you to, that by the time we meet Logan in X-Men, he will have lost his memory. He doesn't know about all this stuff that's happened to him. So we're just going to get to that. There's nothing dramatically interesting with the characters, because we know it's like, okay, we know he's not going to die. There's no kind of threat to his life or anything. So what should matter is the dramatic relationship between him and Victor. That's completely inert and is thrown away with just a bunch of other stock stupid lines.
Well, it's things like, well, we know Danny Houston's character is the bad guy in X2, so we know he's not going to die.
He will grow up to become Brian Cox.
Good for him. And then we know that, like, Sabretooth is in other movies, and this movie is definitely trying to be beholden to the canon that we know of the franchise so far, because we're 4 movies in. It has all the reason in the world to want to adhere to its canon. So we know Sabretooth's going to show up again later. So there are so many dissatisfying non-resolutions at the end of this film. Really, the only thing that happens that can be called an ending is the woman he believed to be his lover was actually died. She dies twice in the movie, once fake and then once for real. And then it feels like nothing either time. And then Deadpool gets his head cut off. But, where has that landed us?
Who cares?
Yeah.
Talking also about our like, this movie wants to be very serious, but its seriousness is also steeped in over-the-top melodrama. You and I counted, there are at least 6 scenes in this movie where a character has a prolonged scream, often either directly into the camera or up into the sky.
Yeah, at the camera.
Yes. And so it's like, that is just over the top. And it's not that moment, those kind of moments can't work and be dramatically effective, but this movie doesn't see them as what they are. And compounded upon with all these filmmaking issues, the narrative, the story, and where it eventually ends up, it's just all bad. There are very, very, very few redeeming qualities to this movie.
There are a couple nice sets. That's about it. Jackman's hair. There are some fun jokes to be made at the expense of Jackman's wacky hairstyle in this movie. It's not nearly as wacky as it is in some of the other X-Men movies, but it's so big. There's just so much volume. There's this incredible shot. It's a low angle looking up at Hugh Jackman as he's bending down over a defeated Liev Schreiber. And his hair is just so fucking enormous. You said to me, it's like a UFO of hair landed on his head. I thought that was funny. And then I said, the real Wolverine was the wig we made along the way.
I mean, that's the thing. It's unfortunate because this is a very easy movie to make fun of, which is why I think in some circles it's certainly railed against. It's like, yeah, this is the worst X-Men movie, so just have a laugh at it. But at the end of the day, I don't even think it's worth that. I said to you that X-Men Origins Wolverine made me think of like this. It's like a movie that would play on a monitor when you're standing in line for a theme park ride, where it's like, this is completely empty. It is just trying to put in the mechanics of the experience you're about to have. Like, it's not interested in being its own thing. Like, X-Men Origins Wolverine should be its own standalone thing, but really it's just acting as like a wiki article for the X-Men movies you already saw.
We've complained about similar things with the Star Wars story movies, Rogue One in particular.
Right.
which is just a little fill-in explanation. It's basically like putting Bondo over a crack and just sort of filling it in. It's like, well, that's not substance. It's filling in blanks, but it's only doing so because we know where a certain story ends and where a certain story begins. To try and create effective drama in the gaps between stories is exceptionally difficult because there's already sort of a preordained notion to like, well, we know where this has to end. We do say something similar about spoilers. It's like, well, it's way more important to know how something happens rather than what. So I think if you look at a Wolverine origin story, it's like, well, I can kind of tell what happens. So how does it happen? Like, what is interesting about how the story happens? And the answer...
Well, and also why.
Well, yeah, why and how. And the how is certainly not there. It's just, how does it happen? Very poorly.
But here's what's interesting. These issues that we have, X-Men First Class addresses them. We're talking about like, okay, as a prequel, you're going in with characters that you know where they're going to end up. You know things are going to happen in a certain way to get them to this point. X-Men First Class isn't really concerned about being a wiki article and a fill-in, a gap filler for what we didn't know about Professor X and Magneto. Instead, it is about those characters. It's about the emotion of their meeting and how their philosophies were forged, how their friendship was forged. It's not really about, well, we got, like, while this happens, it's not really about, well, how did Magneto get his helmet and how did Professor X end up in a wheelchair? While those things happen, they're not the reason for the movie.
Right. Yeah, the movie finds a justification for its existence. It's not just a factoid delivery service. It is actually establishing not just how the surface elements of the characters came to exist, like how did the Wolverine get his silver claws? It is, what does it mean? And like, how did the characters' experience and perspective put them in a place where this might happen? And it's, how do we amplify the drama of this? Like X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men First Class is made in such a way that it could, in theory, link up to Bryan Singer's X-Men film, but it's not as nearly concerned with that as X-Men Origins Wolverine was. It's mostly trying to do its own thing, much to its benefit.
Yeah, well, here's what's so interesting is that X-Men First Class starts with a scene we've seen before. It opens with the opening or redoing of the opening of the first X-Men, which is Eric Lensher, who will come to know as Magneto, him being separated from his parents during, the Nazi occupation of, I believe it's Poland. And, being separated to be taken off to the concentration camps, and him reaching out and his powers, finally showing themselves, and him pulling the gate down a bit. That is, I all credit to the first X-Men movie. That is a astonishingly powerful mission statement in terms of how we want to utilize these characters, the emotion, the metaphor of what we're seeing here. And then X-Men First Class is like, well, let's continue from that point because that's interesting as an origin story.
Yeah, I think First Class is really a great exercise in curation and being given this available data of saying like, well, here's who these characters are, or here's what we know them to be based on previous films. So let's make stories about those characters, and let's take the most valuable elements from prior entries and make that a good jumping off point. But they also do some really clever subversion. It's easy to understand why Magneto, I say it's easy to understand, but I think they say, I understand why Magneto is the way he is in the first X-Men movie, right? That prologue is just powerful enough to let us know like why he would be that way. Mm-hmm. But I like that X-Men Origins, or not X-Men Origins, I like that X-Men First Class took a different approach with Xavier and not making him this young Patrick Stewart. They actually cast somebody who doesn't look all that much like him, doesn't sound all that much like him, and they make him this like party boy. He's trying to pick up chicks. He's trying to drink. Like, it's this totally different take on the character.
He's somebody that if you know Professor X from the previous movies, this is surprising. If you don't, this is still just a brand new, interesting character. Like, that's what I mean. That's so much of what I think works about the prequelizing efforts of First Class is that it doesn't assume the things you know. Because if this was following the X-Men Origins Wolverine line of thinking, we wouldn't even see that scene of Magneto pulling the gate down. It would just like, yeah, you know what that is. So we'll just start with him like being experimented on. And it's like, oh, okay, but that's a really important thing. And then it follows it up with us being introduced to Sebastian Shaw, played by Kevin Bacon, and him trying to get Eric to showcase his powers by moving a small silver coin. And if he doesn't, he's going to shoot Eric's mom. So that is already, it's like, okay, well, this is a brand new addition to the origin that we didn't know, but it still has thematic and emotional resonance. But more so even than that stuff, the thing that makes First Class a really, really good movie, especially in comparison to X-Men Origins Wolverine, is the filmmaking.
Yeah. I mean, you compare, Gavin Hood's style on X-Men Origins Wolverine to the directorial style of Matthew Vaughn, night and day. I mean, totally different approaches. And I'm not even talking about the perception of quality. I mean, just they come from very different schools of thought, clearly. Matthew Vaughn, his stylistic stuff, we've seen at this point Kick-Ass, right? Kick-Ass came out before this?
I believe so, yeah.
So we had sort of a sense of his cheekiness and his sense of humor and his propensity to use, bright colors and things like that. But his approach to First Class is way more focused on making an earnest, well, basically a Bond movie with people with superpowers in it. It really does hit all the sort of necessary elements of what makes a fun Bond flick from that era. And it captures all that. But the pace of scenes, where cuts lie, his choice on where to put the camera. Like you mentioned early on, there's a scene with young Magneto and Sebastian Shaw, and there's a 180 cut in that scene. The camera goes from one side of the room to the other, which in continuity editing is often looked down upon because it takes two characters and then inverts their positions on screen. It's geographically confusing. But revealing the other side of the room is one cut that contains so much power.
It hits you like a ton of bricks in that realization that, oh, we've only been seeing, 3/4 of this room. And when we see what's on the other side, it's this big operating table with these just, comical like meat cleavers and
hacksaws and all sorts of horrible shit.
It hits, it has resonance. And that's the thing is like, I will say this about X-Men Origins Wolverine. It has style. It is not without style, but its style is so abrasive and I think a lot of times butts up against what the actual scene is trying to do in any given moment. Whereas First Class, it is certainly a stylish movie, but it's also a style that understands in every scene the space that it's working within, and I mean space, both literal space and temporal space, and understands that, yes, you can do things that are stylish without calling a huge bunch of attention to it.
Yeah. For instance, one of the biggest stylistic differences is the sheer amount of cutting. I have not counted the number of jump cuts in the movie, but when you watch X-Men First Class, you'll perceive that there are fewer cuts. That's just the perception, the feeling that you get. Mm-hmm. They're holding on shots longer. It's a longer average shot length throughout the movie. In X-Men Origins Wolverine, there's a lot of sort of unmotivated cutting. It's like, well, I'm not quite sure why they cut to that angle, or I'm not sure why they're cutting to this person's reaction in this dialogue scene. It's just, I don't know, a style that is based on the trends of chaos cinema, I think, because that was a popular thing at the time. Mm-hmm. Like Taken and its success, I think, spawned this small trend, luckily it has since died out, of using a lot of cutting to create a frenetic sense. And while I think the action in X-Men Origins Wolverine is not incomprehensible, and in First Class, it's so measured by comparison.
I totally agree. There are things that First Class does where it's so clearly, I think about the storyboarding aspect. I would love to see the storyboards from X-Men Origins Wolverine, because if they're anything by what's reflected in the finished movie, that's got to be a nightmare of a storyboard. But with X-Men First Class, I can see the storyboards in my mind when certain scenes happen. For example, when Eric, now as an adult, goes to a bank to track down some of the former Nazis that he's trying to get revenge on, there's a wonderful shot of him. We're actually focused on the bank manager, and we only see Eric reflected in a bar of Nazi gold that's on the table. Or in that same scene, Eric is going to yank out the metal fillings of the bank manager as he tortures him to get the information, and we have a shot inside of the mouth. Like, it's like, yeah, that's a cool idea, but it's also an idea that was clearly structured out beforehand so that there is a defined and purposeful rhythm to the scene.
Yes. Yeah. The pace of the cutting builds and builds to a point where you reach that little pop moment and the tooth comes out of the guy's mouth, and it's such an effective scene. This is the stuff that may have in fact come from drafts of the X-Men Origins Magneto movie, which never happened. Mm-hmm. That stuff may have been folded in to X-Men First Class. And there are a lot of writing credits on X-Men First Class. The story by credits are from Sheldon Turner and Bryan Singer. The screenplay is credited to 4 individual writers, but it's actually 2 teams. You had Ashley Miller and Zach Stentz work on a draft, and then you had Jane Goldman and Matthew Vaughn work on another draft. So it's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. It's frankly a miracle that this script ended up as cohesive as it is, considering how many people are credited. But Jane Goldman and Matthew Vaughn clearly had a strong hand in crafting the script, because it's just such a different movie from any of the other X-Men films.
And I think that is a real plus, but I think it was also partially a reason for people not being as accepting about this at the time. One, because it's following up X-Men Origins Wolverine, which in franchise thinking, it's always that the following movie is going to either benefit or pay for the sins of the previous movie.
Yeah.
And First Class also was presenting itself as something very different than what the X-Men franchise had established in terms of tone and look.
It didn't have Wolverine in it. I mean, he's in a scene, but
yes,
the film was not marketed as a Wolverine movie,
right, which
the other 4 films had. And if you remember the posters and the trailers from X-Men First Class, none of them were good.
No, I did not see this in theaters because I was like, I think I'm done with these X-Men movies.
I read the reviews, and the reviews were good enough to make me go see it in theaters, and I liked it quite a lot. But the marketing was just terrible, and the box office returns really show it. I mean, this is, for the kind of blockbuster it is, the big PG-13 summer movie it is, like, it underperformed like crazy.
Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate because I think First Class, while not being perfect at everything it wants to do, I think one of the issues that it has is kind of thrust upon it. It has to be an X-Men movie, which means it has to have a group that you could call the X-Men.
Sure.
And I think the group element of getting these different kids together, while the actual act of getting them together, it's a really wonderful montage, and later their training of their powers, like the montages in this are all aces. The thing is, they're never really treated as full-fledged characters. They're stripped down to where they each get their own little arcs, and they all work. But I think it's very clear that the movie's not as interested in that as it is the main characters of Charles Xavier, Eric Lensher, and Sebastian Shaw.
Yes, it's clear that this is not necessarily an ensemble cast film, although it has an exceptionally large cast and many, many characters. Mm-hmm. It knows it has to really play up the relationship between Magneto and Xavier. And so by focusing on that and like sort of letting everything else be an organic extension of that, the film finds its footing and it finds its structure. But I don't think it necessarily does a bad, disservice to any number of these characters, because I like them. I think the movie does an exceptional job of handling this many characters.
No, I agree with that. It's just a matter of that if, as an X-Men movie, in terms of being this group superhero thing, that element is a lot less what it's actually interested in. And that's fine.
Right. Yeah, like they try to build a crew, and then a few scenes later, after they've tried to establish the crew's dead. You know what I mean?
Right. They kill somebody, and it's but even so, in all that, I think I love all of the costuming and makeup decisions in this movie. Our boy Jason Fleming showing up as a Red Devil man, Azazel, looks great. He might be my favorite looking thing in the movie.
Yeah, Azazel's got a great makeup. They do a good job of just differentiating the mutants visually, which is cool. For such a diverse and fun group as mutants are presented in the Marvel comics, it's nice to see a decent reflection of that here. Beast has an entirely new look, that nothing like nothing we've seen before. I know they've kind of done some similar things in certain comics, but this is not what people expect the character of Beast to look like.
No, for sure. There's a couple things. I don't think Jennifer Lawrence is great in the movie.
She's not.
I don't think she's bad, but I also think it's kind of her style of acting. And I don't mean that as like, oh, she's a bad actress. Like, no, most of the time she's either playing things on a 1 or a 10 in her career.
Yeah, she's pretty reserved in this movie. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but she's clearly offering a different kind of performance than, say, McAvoy is.
I think it is miraculous that for two characters that were almost instantly iconic by casting Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen in the original movies, the fact that McAvoy and Fassbender are able to craft their versions of these characters without ever being sacrilegious to Stewart and McKellen, without ever falling into caricature or impersonation, I think that is nothing short of amazing.
Yeah, I mean, they really do take the characters and run with them. They create their own thing. Fassbender, he's got his sort of trademark Irish lilt. He never really breaks out of that. He just sounds like an Irish dude all the time. Mm-hmm. And then, it would be a huge mistake for a guy like McAvoy to imitate Patrick Stewart, because, the fun thing is exploring the difference between the two portrayals. Like that's, the subversion of that is really, really satisfying to see. It's also really satisfying to notice just how much they were able to change the Mystique makeup from this movie and the next. Like on Jennifer Lawrence, the appliances are really thick and obvious and kind of platey on her in this movie. And then in, for instance, Days of Future Past, the appliances are much more subtle.
I mean, by the time they get to Dark Phoenix, they're just like, just dump blue paint on her. We're not doing anything else.
Right. Yeah, and then they put a couple little dots on her, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah. First Class, I think, a couple other things. Kevin Bacon, great villain. You talk about this as a Bond movie. He's definitely playing it as an old school classic comic book Bond villain.
For sure.
And he's great. Like, he's absolutely fantastic in the role. He's wonderfully evil. That whole opening scene is with him and Eric as a child is it's in contention for my favorite in the entire franchise.
I also think this movie, speaking of that scene, this movie does a really good job of treating its audience like grown-ups, in that it does things like it features a lot of subtitled dialogue in foreign languages, Russian, French, German. It really has no qualms about being sort of the more grown up, more international X-Men film.
Well, it's also clear that Vaughn was, I think, most excited to do a comic book version of the 60s, because I love how this movie appropriates the era for cool set stuff and costumes and locations and everything. And even what's going on in the story. Eventually, this ties into the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's something that the future X-Men movies that were set in different decades never took this kind of advantage of.
Yeah, it's not afraid to look a little dweeby in its retro stylings.
But that makes it so much more personable.
Yeah, there's this whole stuff set on Sebastian Shaw's white submarine. Like, everything is white on board the submarine, which is really goofy and funny, but also the movie manages to make it look incredibly cool. Like there's this whole mirrored chamber where he keeps the nuclear reactor for his submarine. And it's like any scene that's set in there is like, this is awesome. Like, this is a nothing set. It's all just mirrors and then like a tube with a bunch of glowing stuff in it, and that's it. But god damn if they don't manage to make stuff like that look compelling.
And I mean, there's just so much, Magneto, when we cut to him and there's this wonderful setup of the Nazi coin that he has being used to transition to him as an adult, and him flinging the coin into the picture of Sebastian Shaw, which is then paid off in what might be one of my favorite PG-13 deaths of any movie.
Yeah, it's pretty it's pretty hardcore. And again, the shots in this are really long. Like, they're trying to draw a parallel between how Charles Xavier feels, like he's in this guy's brain when a coin is getting driven through it, and it happens fucking slowly. It's really
So
painful
slow.
and gross. And then, we've talked about how bad X-Men Origins Wolverine was at sort of stringing scenes together into a cohesive story. One of the ways movies do that is scene-to-scene transitions. Here, they're so much more motivated, and it's hard because this movie is so scattered all over the place. It's a kind of a globe-trotting film, so it has to show, the super on screen of like where we are. But the transitions feel much more natural and motivated. For instance, when Rose Byrne's character is talking to her sort of CIA higher up, she's like, we need to find an expert on genetic mutation. And we cut to Professor Charles Xavier being named as a professor of genetics for the first time. It's like, well, okay, this is how the movie is linking the chain together. And then after that, Jennifer Lawrence says to James McAvoy, let's get a drink. And then we cut to Magneto walking into a bar in Argentina.
Exactly.
So it's little stuff like that. It's really well done.
That's what, the kind of things that assist in flow and pacing. Real quick, I know we're getting to the tail end, but that Argentina scene in that bar is so awesome.
And not just because it's dark and violent, but like, God, it's so well made, and it so perfectly captures his idea of what he's doing and why he's doing it. Like, his establishment of motivation is done through action.
Well, and even in the framing of the setup where it's like, this is how you do PG-13 violence, where there's this nice wide shot of him sitting at the table when he pulls the knife out and throws it into the bartender and then retracts it back with his power and stabs the guy in the hand again. It holds on that shot instead of, having to follow the knife and, zip over to, whoa, look at it hit and now it's coming back. It's like, it just lets it play out.
Yeah, the camera's not whooshing around everywhere.
Right. The music is great. I really like the kind of main Magneto theme in this.
Yeah, this has my favorite score of all the X-Men movies. The X-Men movies don't have like bad scores among them, but this is, I think, the best one. And it makes me sad because they abandoned all of the themes that they had composed for this film. It pisses me off. It really pisses me off how they actually abandoned so much of what works about this film. Clearly Matthew Vaughn was not invited back because the film underperformed. It just did not do as well as Fox needed it to do. They knew they wanted to keep making X-Men movies,
and he got to go off and do his R-rated Bond movie that he clearly was trying to finagle into this X-Men movie. He goes and makes Kingsman.
But it's odd because you watch Matthew Vaughn's other movies like Kingsman and Kick-Ass and, Kingsman 2, and it's like, well, clearly Vaughn has this odd idea about taste. He wants his movies to have this sort of veneer of class, but he also likes things like Kick-Ass, which is just so intentionally crass. And that crassness is not at all present in X-Men First Class. It's an extraordinarily classy film, strangely enough.
Yeah, I agreed. And I just think that there's so many things. The climax not really being about killing the big Bond villain, but then turning it around. It's like, no, it's about Magneto and about his philosophy and what's built him to this point as a character. Like, that is so smart. That's good understanding that it doesn't matter that what that ends up being from a wiki article standpoint is like, and that's how Magneto got his helmet. Like, that's what happens in that scene, but it's so inconsequential to what's actually happening in the moment.
Well, philosophically, the way this movie sort of explores all of its beats is just nothing short of astounding. The scene where Magneto is going to turn all of the missile fire around and potentially blow up a whole bunch of U.S. Navy ships.
And Russians.
And Russians as well. He says, I've been at the mercy of men following orders. Never again. I get chills. We know exactly why he is saying that. We know the pain he's gone through. And this movie does a great job of expressing all that. It's kind of similar the way that it ends in X-Men Origins Wolverine in structure, because neither of these movies can end on really happy notes. They both have to have kind of tragic endings. We know at the end of this that we'll probably see Xavier in a wheelchair. Okay, so we know he's going to be paralyzed somehow. That's tragic. We know that Magneto is going to fall to the dark side in a way, and we have to perceive that as kind of a tragedy. And we know that Mystique is probably going to fall to his, darker tendencies as well, and that has to play as a tragedy. And then we also know that, Xavier's hope of mutants being sort of validated before the world for preventing the Cuban Missile Crisis, we know that's going to fall through. So who's happy at the end of X-Men First Class? Pretty much nobody.
Well, I think there's a good enough ending between Xavier and Moira. He's saying like, look, we're still on the government side. And of course, it's like, we're just G-men without the G. And she's going to be like, no, you're X-Men. It's like, okay, it's cute. Like, okay, fine. Like that's fine, cute fan service prequelizing that doesn't feel like, yeah, we built the whole movie to just do that. Like it's like, no, I just cared about these characters and how they related to one another.
But X-Men Origins Wolverine has to end on a similarly tragic note. We know that our character has to lose his memory, incur some sort of injury. He's going to lose the woman he loves. He's not going to get to kill the bad guy. He's not going to kill his evil brother. Like, it just can't deliver on these things that you want for these characters.
Mm-hmm. Like we said, you couldn't be more polar opposite with these two movies in terms of quality. But also, I think in the intention, like the intention behind them, so similar when you look at it from a surface level that, okay, we want to tell a prequel story about important characters to the X-Men lore, and because we know people like these characters. But X-Men Origins Wolverine gets caught up in all the worst elements of prequelizing, which is fan service for fan service sake, doing things that don't really matter from a character standpoint, only from plotting. And First Class ticks those boxes. It gets those things done, but it's not its intention. Its intention is, who are Charles Xavier and Eric Lehnsherr, and why are they so diametrically opposed by the time they grow up to be Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen? Like, what could it be that separated them, but still they view them, that they have a friendship?
And that friendship is totally sold on that moment where they're doing that training montage at the Xavier mansion, and he's trying to get Magneto to move the satellite dish in the distance. That scene fucking rocks.
Well, and because there's good implementation of style as opposed to X-Men Origins Wolverine, where the style is just to be cool, man.
Well, there's genuine sentimentality and tenderness between these characters. It's like, we know we have to have like an established closeness between them. We know that the relationship has to mean something between them, so that when their friendship is lost, that we feel that loss too. And so when you establish this moment of emotional intimacy between these two characters, it means something. It's worth something to us.
It's so good. And I don't know where the consensus is now on First Class. I seem to get the idea that it's not super beloved primarily because it acts as something of a soft reboot, and it's one of the things that people love to rag on, the X-Men canon is so messed up with these movies. And it's like, I don't care about focusing on that. I care about what are these movies doing on their own merits. And First Class is the one that just stands leagues above a lot of the X-Men movies. I think it might be my favorite of the entire franchise.
It's my clear favorite of the entire franchise. Logan's good. I enjoyed Logan. It had things to say, and it had an appropriately sort of elegiac tone. It was an elegy for a franchise and for a character. And it, stylistically felt like it was doing the right thing for itself. Much in the same way that First Class feels. It's a quality entry that is really less concerned with its status as a franchise entry and more about being, a proper story unto itself.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I think that can send us over to the shelf, where we pick a movie or some other piece of media that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to go to genrevision.com, comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks, and we'll feature them on next week's episode. Travis, what's your shelf pick for X-Men Origins Wolverine and X-Men First Class?
Well, this is not a movie I recommend, but it is an oddly close pairing to X-Men Origins Wolverine. And it suffers many of the same problems. This is The Predator, the Shane Black sequel to one of the most beloved action sci-fi films of all time. We're talking about the same sort of problems at the script level where things don't seem to match up. Like there's not a real cohesive narrative from start to finish. Scenes don't link up in the way they should. There's a lot of tough guy, cool dude team shit, some military stuff going on, black ops, spec ops kind of stuff. And it seems to be a lot of hollow cool without understanding what's cool about those things, which is so odd to say about a Shane Black movie because Shane Black knows what's cool. I mean, we've all seen The Nice Guys, I would hope. So it features the surface elements of what people would expect and like about a Predator movie, like, big fuck off predators and some cool effects and like
right.
a practical predator, just like Wolverine has like, hey, it has all the fucking, slashing and stuff like that you could want. And
don't worry, he will jump out of a water tank and scream. Like,
yeah, it features those surface elements that I guess people would want, but in no way does it package them in a movie that actually feels good to watch at any time.
Yeah, I mean, go listen to our episode that we did on The Predator.
So they make an odd pairing with one another in that they just tonally, I feel like they're similar. One obviously has a bigger comedic bent than the other one. Like Shane Black's, he's never going to make a non-funny movie. It's just sort of in his blood to make a funny action comedy. But so many of the same sort of technical issues persist throughout the making of these two films. The Predator has a distinct disadvantage of having a third act that it had to reshoot for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, oddly similar. I was having big flashbacks to The Predator while watching Wolverine. What are you going to pull off the shelf, sir?
Well, I'm actually going to go with a TV show because when it comes to doing prequels like this, I think when it's all said and done, the best example we're going to have in our recent days, it's got to be Better Call Saul. When this was announced as a spinoff, I, like a lot of people, were like, really? Huh, okay. And was not honestly crazy about it. Like I was like, well, I trust these guys because they made a great show in Breaking Bad, but this is what you want to do. It just feels, at first I was like, is this just because they got to keep this brand going because it's making so much money and being so pop culturally relevant? And Better Call Saul has, at this point, for me, eclipsed Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad is monumental.
Oh, unquestionably.
Yeah, I mean, Better Call Saul is a more nuanced exploration of that world. I'm finally getting into the later seasons of Better Call Saul now. Like, I had watched the first season when it first hit Netflix, and I was like, that was really good. And then I just, for whatever reason, just never watched season 2, 3, or 4, and that's what I'm doing now. So now I'm in season 4. I love the show. It's fucking great. Dramatically, it's incredibly satisfying. Stylistically, extraordinary.
Yes.
The lighting on the show is just awesome.
And for my shelf purposes, this is what you need to think about when you're doing prequelization. Better Call Saul is not a story that is super focused on, well, we got to know how he got that office eventually. That will happen, but it's not what the movie's thinking about. What's so interesting is I was thinking about the Millennium Falcon dice that have been in the new Disney movies that were this thing that I never noticed before and became this huge, calling card for a lot of those movies. I was like, I didn't even know they were there originally. And that they never had the weight that those movies tried to put on them. Cut to Better Call Saul. When we see Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad, he wears a ring. I never noticed that he wore a ring, but he wears a ring. And in Better Call Saul, the show, they show you the origin of that ring and why it matters and what it means to Jimmy McGill. And it rules. It absolutely lands. And I think it's because they weren't really concentrating on, well, we need to tell the story of what this ring was. It was that, what does this mean? What is the thematic resonance that this has other than being a thing that belonged to a character?
Right. It's like, how can we use this as an emotionally charged symbol?
Right.
To represent a certain thing? You know, what does this mean in close-up? You know, when we show a close-up of this, what are we thinking about? What is Jimmy thinking about?
Yeah. What does it evoke? Because the dice in the Disney movie, Disney Star Wars, it evokes, well, that's Han Solo. Like, it doesn't evoke an actual history or a meaning any deeper than that's a thing that a character had.
Well, I mean, it's meant to evoke a memory, but not for the character. It's meant to evoke our memory of how much we love Han Solo in pop culture.
Right. It's the audience's memory. And Better Call Saul is not a show that is wrapped up in that stuff, even though you will see it's like, why does Saul Goodman wear such garish suits? You'll see in this show, but it's not really that the show felt the need to like, well, we have to explain that. It flows into natural character beats and character buildup throughout this story. It's a phenomenal experiment that I think, I mean, even if it doesn't stick the landing, which it certainly could, you know, trying to tie that final link between the prequel and the previous story can be very difficult. And, you know, we can have a Rogue One situation where it's like, oh, yeah, this all happened like 2 seconds before Star Wars kicked off. We'll see. But at this point, I am just flabbergasted at how phenomenal Better Call Saul has been on its own merit. Like, of course, if you've seen Breaking Bad, it adds so many layers to the show and, you know, certain undercurrents to things. But I think if you watch this show and didn't see Breaking Bad, all this stuff still resonates on its own. It still hits because it's interested in telling its own standalone story, not just being a puzzle piece that connects to the bigger jigsaw that was Breaking Bad.
Yeah, they do a little bit of playing around, you know, when certain characters come back, but they don't diddle around with it too much. You know, they get to the point. It's like, well, how can we recontextualize this character for Jimmy's perspective? So again, it's really a masterpiece on the level of Breaking Bad. And like you said, in some ways, I feel like it has eclipsed the other show. Although I hate to put the two in a pissing contest with one another.
Well, they're doing, even though they're exploring a lot of the same thematic interests, they're doing it in very different ways.
Right. Well, even though there may be similar tones.
There's similar tones, there's similar style, there's similar, I think, rhythms, but I'm not going to make this into a whole thing about Better Call Saul versus Breaking Bad, but Better Call Saul learned a lot from Breaking Bad and has used that knowledge to do something that can afford even more nuance. It doesn't have to go as big as some stuff in Breaking Bad did.
Yeah.
Because it understands that we can make the bigness the emotional moments for a character. A car crash in Breaking Bad probably wouldn't seem that enormous because we've seen Walter White explode fulminated mercury and, you know, done all this crazy stuff. But a car crash in Better Call Saul is like an atom bomb going off.
It's you know, you feel like those moments is like, well, that's a bell that can't be unrung.
Right.
You know.
So I thoroughly recommend that show to everybody, especially if just to see how you can approach prequelization.
All right, so last week's episode was a versus on Dragonheart versus Reign of Fire. Let's talk about what our listeners pulled off the shelf to recommend for that pairing.
Yeah, well, so we got a couple more dragon flicks. Eric Fuchs recommended Ghidorah, the three-headed monster from 1964, where Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan, all heroes of their own movies, team up to fight a golden dragon from space. But yeah, that is one of the better of that era of Godzilla movies. Mr. Milksteak had the shelf pick of Outlander from 2008, an interesting genre mashup version of Beowulf starring James Caviezel as a spaceman who arrives in Iron Age Norway, forcing him to blend in with the Nordic culture while pursuing the dragon-like creature that caused his ship to crash and is now killing the local villagers. I never saw that.
I've seen this movie. The only thing I remember about it is the monster design. That's it.
Okay, I mean, it's
not even a terribly memorable monster, to be honest.
All right. I definitely remember the poster and seeing it being advertised, but never saw it, so I can't say anything about that. Pale Fire's shelf pick was X-Files Fight the Future, another solid and forgotten flick from Rob Bowman. That's such a can of worms. Maybe one day we'll get into the X-Files movie on this show, because I don't think it's a bad movie, but I think the worst thing about it is that it has to be a movie.
That's unfortunate, but I actually am in that movie's corner. I like it quite a bit.
I'm in its corner at the end, but I recognize like a lot of the problems with it in terms of like having to function in this weird limbo of trying to be a blockbuster crowd pleaser while also being a continuation of the TV show and also being the weird thing that the X-Files was. It has to wear so many hats, and that's not its fault.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the X-Files. It's good. One of these days I'll revisit I Want to Believe and see how I stand on that now.
I don't want to believe that I will see that movie ever again.
But we'll see. Ryan Covey had The Ghost and the Darkness, which is with Val Kilmer and Michael Douglas. Two lions in an African railroad aren't dragons in a post-apocalyptic future, but it feels tonally in sync with what Reign of Fire was going for. I have got to revisit that because I saw that when it hit video, and I remember really liking it.
I saw it. I liked it. I don't remember hardly anything else about it.
Yeah, I wonder if it might be one of those movies where it's like, yeah, it is good, but it doesn't have a lot of staying power. But I remember my experience with it being like, yeah, this is a good movie, and it's kind of a monster movie of sorts, just with lions, you know.
Yeah.
So definitely one I need to revisit. And JT had the shelf pick of, I'm going to go obvious and say, How to Train Your Dragon. Originally, I only watched this because it was too lazy to get off my couch. It was DreamWorks Animation, was expecting another Madagascar Blawfest, and less than 50 minutes in, I was hooked. I've never seen How to Train Your Dragon.
Neither have I. I know they're pretty well regarded.
Yeah, I can't speak to all of the movies in the franchise, but I know it was a big deal because that first one was the one that I don't remember what the competing movie was, but that it beat Disney that year at the Oscars. So, you know, that's already kind of triumphant in some regard. But I've always kind of been like, yeah, maybe one of these days I'll see it because I like dragons a lot and could be cute. I like that toothless design.
I'm sure they're fine.
Ryan Covey also said, I'm not going to waste my time coming up with targeted shelf picks for both of these, but I will pick Rampage, which I did not realize either of you had seen, and I really, really feel you need to. We're going to come back to that in just a minute, so hold your thoughts on that, but let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Very briefly, I wanted to talk about a new album that I can't stop listening to. It is from a young female British pop star named Dua Lipa, and she had a single a couple years ago that I couldn't stop listening to again. So I was not necessarily looking forward to this new album, but I was keeping an eye on it. And it came out. I kept seeing buzz about it. A lot of reviews were saying the album's really good. It's called Future Nostalgia. Kind of a silly album title, but you know what? This album's a fucking banger. It's really good.
Yeah, you dropped that one song in our group chat, and I was like, yeah, this is. I don't think I've heard anything else from her.
There's one other song I can share. It's actually a remix of a single she had that I think is just fucking killer. So I'll share that with you shortly, and I can actually put it in the show notes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Dua Lipa, Future Nostalgia. I would put it in some kind of similar crossover territory with, say, Lady Gaga, but it's less focused on the sort of art pop aspect of it and is a little bit more focused on, let's say, like French house, synth wave. It combines all that into something I think that's really, really tasty, a really delicious pop confection. I'm having a great time with the record.
Nice.
What, sir, have you been consuming?
Well, living that quarantine lifestyle. Outbreak was on Netflix and ended up watching that, which is I haven't seen it maybe in close to 10 years. And I certainly remember enjoying my time with it. I remember it coming out on video and all that. But upon revisit, Outbreak, I enjoyed my time with Outbreak, but man, it is just glorious B-movie trash.
You said it was like a Canon film.
Yeah, well, I called it the Canon Films version of Contagion, which I've not seen Contagion, to be fair, but it's incredible considering, you know, it's got all these prestige actors and was a huge, huge budget blockbuster push, you know, from Warner Brothers. And it's just, it is so goofball, unintentionally so. it had me smiling a lot, but not for the reasons I think it wanted me to. And I hate to say it because it sounds like it was ironic, but it's also like, yeah, what you thought was really serious and dramatic in this regard, it just comes off like in big comic book ways now, which was actually a really fun time. The movie kind of sputters out towards the end for me. But, you know, this is a movie where Cuba Gooding Jr. shoots a monkey with a tranquilizer gun. And the way that happens is so great.
I love the reaction shot from the monkey. It's fucking like grade A monkey acting.
It's amazing. It's so good. It's a good time. I mean, it was kind of fun, cheesy thriller action that I kind of needed. And I guess at some point I'm going to have to finally do what everybody else is doing and watch Contagion.
I mean, if you're into that shit,
we'll see.
I watched it for the first time a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I liked that Outbreak was fun and silly, and I don't think Contagion will be that. But let's wrap things up with our
Comment of the Week.
And we're coming back to loyal listener Mr. Milksteak in replying to Ryan Covey saying, "Nothing makes me happier than knowing Rampage has been suggested as a shelf pick 2 weeks in a row," which I guess that's what's going on now. I guess, and Ryan responded saying, "This feels moronic to say about a 4-quadrant movie that made a pretty tidy sum at the box office, but it's underrated." Maybe I'll have to finally see Rampage. I don't know. Like
I'm gonna let you do that one. Occasionally, I get a little bit of shit on this podcast for being like the snobby guy, but you know what? I don't think I can go there with Rampage. As much as I love monster movies, I just don't think I can do it. And it has less to do with its use of monsters and more to do with its use of The Rock as like bland hero guy.
Yeah, it's the thing that has kept me from watching it is just kind of the big mass destruction stuff. I'm like, there's only so many times I can see that you have to do something really interesting and stylistic to make that seem at all engaging to me. Like, we've seen it so many times in the past, you know, in pretty much every movie post Independence Day, where it's like, how do you make that kind of mass city destruction fun and appealing? And I don't even say that in like oh man, I'm just bummed out from, you know, post 9/11, I don't want to see that stuff. It's like, no, I just filmmaking style wise, like, how is that interesting and fun? But we did get a GIF shared in there where somebody gets eaten by the giant ape, and I was like, that is pretty fun. So we'll see. Maybe I'll report back if I do see Rampage. But next week we're going to be back on Global Gonzo with At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul. This is the first of the Coffin Joe movies, which we'll talk a little bit more about who Coffin Joe is next week. But this is a Brazilian horror movie from the 60s that I'm so stoked to see, and hopefully y'all will be too. So come back next week. As always, we want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on Genre Vision. Jimmy.
Jimmy the Mutant.
Ooh, shiny Jimmy. Liev Schreiber's not nearly Canadian enough.
Is anybody, I mean, in this movie?
No.
Jimmy.
Nobody kills my brother except me. Jimmy.
My ever-changing fingernails.
His nails are different in every shot. Fucking bizarre. Anyways.